Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 25th of July 2024. I'm on a roll, on the trot, haven't stood up, need a cup of tea, but I'm going to do my Geopolitics video. It is absolutely hammering it out there. It feels like someone's running a bath upstairs. That's the sound of the rain on the roof. It is cats and dogs. This is British summer at its best. Wonderful. I'm inside, staying warm. I've got a hoodie on, for goodness sake. Right, okay. You don't need to know that. I've told you anyway. Tough luck. I'm going to start with some giving props to the UK again. This is, I know that it's going to sound like I'm being a shield for Labour, but there's some really interesting things happening. One is that I get a sense that there's competence in the UK government at the moment. They've hit the ground running. They're trying to do loads of sensible stuff. Starmer's been to NATO. He's chaired a summit in the UK with regard to he's received Zelensky. He's had a cabinet meeting with Zelensky there. There's loads of stuff that's happening that's been really positive, and all of the people that have been placed into positions of department positions have been just pretty solid and just getting on with doing stuff, and it's been really great. And one of the things I mentioned in the military aid video is that there's this security deal that's done between Germany and the UK. One of the things Starmer has said is that he wants to have closer relationships with, kind of reset relationships with the EU. This is really good. He's not saying we're going to jump back into the EU. He's been very careful to say we won't be a member of the EU in my lifetime. Whether that's true or not, I guess you never know. But he's been very careful to say, look, Brexit voters, a lot of you guys who came from the Labour Party back in 2016, I'm not saying that we're going to rejoin the EU. What I am saying is that these are dangerous times and we need to work pretty closely with the EU in terms of trade, but actually in terms of security and defence here. And what's really interesting is, A, we are seeing that. So a security agreement has been made with Germany. But B, we are seeing some opinions from the other direction that are really positive. And this is going to help Ukraine, right, as well. So this is from The Economist. Keir Starmer wants to reset relations with Britain and Europe. And just this little statement, it makes me happy. Right, this is soft power at its best, is a quote one European official told me, as the early evening sun bathed the Oxfordshire countryside. So this is where you had that summit in the UK, and you had all the European leaders there, and you had Zelensky there as well. Quote, the good old British are back. You had this idea that when we were in the EU, yes, we had the odd difficult person like Nigel Farage, but we actually had some power in the EU, some soft power that was often welcomed by others in the EU. We were like sensible members of the EU with Germany and France and whatever. And we're trying to get back on that world stage at the moment. I think that's something that Starmer is trying to do. Like, we need to be taken seriously again. We need to punch above our weight. And we need to be working closely with Europe for our benefit as much as for the world's benefit. And it's really good news. And I think that will help Ukraine going forward. We need that unity for geographically around Ukraine, even if it's not from within the EU. We need unity with the EU. Now, the EU refuses to support Hungary and Slovakia in the transit of Lukoil oil through Ukraine, according to Financial Times. And they had appealed, both Slovakia and Hungary had appealed to the EU to say, hey, sort us out. Look, they're stopping us getting our oil from Russia and Russia making money, and we want that oil. And they've stopped it. And you need to do something about this, EU. And the EU are like, not so much. And Hungary are getting really frustrated in Slovakia because they're not getting that oil. And Ukraine have been frustrated for a very long time because those two countries have been making life difficult for Ukraine to the point where, it arguably Hungary and Slovakia's lack of governmental support might have cost Ukrainian lives. So they've got a very good rationale to hold that oil back as leverage. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. The European Commission has rejected their request to urge Kyiv to lift the recent sanctions against the oil company, according to EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis. Brussels will need more time to gather evidence and assess the legal situation. I mean, it might be that Ukraine are on the wrong side of the law here, but we shall see. But Europe are obviously going to slow roll finding that out, possibly. So Bulgarian president admits blocking appointment of pro-Western ambassador to Kyiv. Bulgaria's caretaker government has bypassed presidential approval to appoint a temporary ambassador to Ukraine, sparking criticism from President Radev. Radev is pro-Russian. He's a president, and it's a bit like Georgia, where the prime minister is pro-Russian, the president is pro-EU and Ukraine. In Bulgaria, it's kind of the other way around. The president is pro-Russia, and the government appears to be much more pro-Ukraine. Although Bulgaria is an interesting place, and there is a lot of disinformation rife there from Russia, and you will have many people in Bulgaria who will be pro-Russian, no doubt. But on the other hand, they are helping Ukraine incredibly with production of weaponry, ordnance, etc., etc. Slovakia joins Putin's party, set to implement a law written in the Kremlin. So Robert Fico's administration, with his Peter Pellegrini, the president there, being pro-Russian, and Robert Fico pro-Russian, president and prime minister. The foreign agents law will be used to jail political opposition, a law of which everyone is guilty when it's selectively enforced, says Jay in Kiev. So Reuters reporting the EU warns Slovakia against the foreign agents law for NGOs. This is how compromised countries inside the EU are. Russia is pulling their strings. It is very scary. And then Chris Owicki says this is a likely prelude to effectively banning foreign media organizations in Russia. So talking about that foreign agents law, Russia is actually taking it further inside Russia. Russia already has it and is trying to get other nations to have this foreign agents law, which basically stops NGOs operating in any given country and means that funding is scrutinized and they are basically shut out of the country, which means, the idea is that, like, if you're being super charitable, it's like, yeah, we don't want foreign influence on our electoral system in our democracy. But what actually is happening is that foreign organizations like media organizations, humanitarian organizations and whatnot end up being shut out of the country. And you get that kind of cultural and soft power influence that is not necessarily bad, right? Is disallowed from being in the country, and then once you've shot that out, you then can become authoritarian and rule your country with absolutely no comeback, and you start changing the laws and make it more and more autocratic. And this is kind of like the direction of travel for Hungary, for Slovakia, for Georgia, and indeed for Russia itself. Russian lawmakers have expanded their undesirable organizations law. Any foreign entity can now receive the label. The law has been changed to include state-affiliated entities. Involvement with undesirable organizations can lead to prison terms of up to 6 years. What you might start seeing is people like Steve Rosenberg, the BBC correspondent, is doing such a good job in Russia, in Moscow still, having to leave. You might get foreign organizations, just media organizations, not being able to operate inside Russia for fear of imprisonment. And there you have it. You have autocracy. You have a full-on dictatorship. It is scary times. Now, 8 EU finance ministers saying that Russia lies about its economic strength, more sanctions are needed. So Russia produces its own statistics on how it's doing, and you just can't trust them. You can't trust them on anything. I've been talking a lot recently about how it does look like the Russian economy is struggling, and indeed Putin himself came out and said, right, we've got to tighten our belts, no one's getting money, we've got no money, it's all basically going to go to the armed forces. So this seems to be a state of affairs that is being more and more evidenced. Russia is spreading a false narrative about the strength of its economy, says the Kyiv Independent, which is likely deteriorating due to Western sanctions. Finance ministers of 8 European countries wrote in an op-ed for The Guardian published on July 24th. And that's probably something I should look into, that Guardian article, because it sounds like it's on point. Right. You remember the other day that the former MP Farion, Ilnia Farion, I think her name was assassinated. She died in hospital. Ukrainian police are examining claims that her murder is linked to the Russian far right. Ukrainian police are examining unverified claims at the moment that spread on Russian social media linking the murder of former Ukrainian lawmaker and linguist. Here it is, Irina Farian to a Russian neo-Nazi group, a police spokesperson told Suspilna. And then we have a Russian delegation will also be reduced to a minimum in Paris, or with Paris Olympics, as only around 15 athletes, there were more than 300 in Tokyo in 2021, were authorised by the International Olympic Committee in mid-July to take part in competitions within a strict framework of neutrality. So it looks like that number of Russian athletes that will be participating under a neutral banner is going to be very small now. Indeed, there have been lots of people being found out with dubious backgrounds that in France, the French, was it DCSG? Is it all the French intelligence services are going to be working overtime? They are working overtime. There are many worries about this upcoming Olympics. It should be such a celebration of joy and sport, and yet you've got Russia, Ukraine, you've got Chinese influence, you've got Hamas and Israel, you've got the Yemenis, the Houthis, all sorts of potentials, and then ISIS still hanging around to disrupt these games. It's I do not envy the French authorities right now, put it that way. Right. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, has just stated that Russian bots are working on social media to sell narratives about Ukraine using AI. Who knew? We all knew this, of course. I've been talking about this for a long time, but we're starting to get much more formal declarations of artificial intelligence being used in the information spaces. Wray said, quote, a Russian government-linked generative AI social media bot farm where they are posing as, among others, US persons and trying again to sell various narratives, and in that case very heavily focused on the war in Ukraine and trying to get everybody turned against each other. And so it's the classic. It's divide, and eventually conquer. And conquering in not so much conventional war manner, but conquering in terms of getting a country to elect the person that you want them to elect to better support your own objectives. So you know my beliefs, my feelings on the US election, but if they get Trump in, and Trump is going to do what he is apparently going to do, which is to reduce sanctions on Russia and to stop the war in Ukraine. And indeed, the news we have now is that he's looking at weakening NATO through other means by changing the goalposts. Then Russia get to win. Like, that is a warfare win. It's just hybrid warfare. They are warring in the information spaces, and they score a victory if they can affect a change that benefits them in another country. And they don't need to do it with tanks. The days of using tanks and weapons of war, I don't know that they're forever gone or going. I mean, there's so many wars going on around the world. But I think people are going to realise that you can affect those kinds of changes, or at least you can precipitate them in the information spaces with a far smaller cost involved in terms of lives lost and money spent. Now, with regard to NATO, Trump really wants to damage NATO. He's just looking for more excuses. Mykola Bielskov here saying that that's a huge irony that in a world post the beginning of Ukraine war, where 2% GDP for defence is not enough, only Donald Trump might force proper decisions. Otherwise, politicians, experts and media failed to persuade NATO country citizens to spend more on defence after February the 24th, 2022. So what's all this concerning? So the Trump camp is considering picking a new fight with NATO on budgets. So after saying that, we spend too much and that these guys don't spend enough, and so everyone then very, very quickly, actually, since the beginning of this war, there's been talk about this for a long time, but actually the decision to up spending to at least 2% has come relatively quickly, and it's been a great success for most NATO members. And they've got to over 2%. Is it 23 of the member states are now going to hit that this year? And now Trump's saying, 2%? I meant actually 3%. Otherwise, we'll stop playing ball. We're going to take our football home. Unless you guys, admit that I'm winning 2-0, I'm going to take my football home and you guys can't play. Right? So unless you, I said that it was 1-1 before. Actually, it's now 4-1 to me. And unless you agree, I'm going home. So I said 2% before. Now I'm saying 3%. And if it's not 3%, I'm taking the US out of NATO. Screw you guys. So advisors discussing setting a goal of 3%. Now, that's one way of looking at it. The other more charitable way for Trump is that actually people do need to be spending 3% on GDP because there are so many threats around the world. So most NATO members only recently hit 2% spending target. Now, you've had the UK saying we're going to hit 2.5%. You've had the Baltics saying it needs to be higher. You've got a lot of nations saying it should be higher. The question is whether Trump is doing this as an excuse to get out of NATO, or whether he's doing this for the benefit of NATO and therefore for the benefit of the world. Now, knowing how Trump operates, I can guess it's not for the benefit of the world. Like, his decisions are only for the benefit of him. Like, personally, not even for America. It's to a benefit of America if it's to a benefit of him, type thing. That's how he sees transactionally the world. Now, talking about the US election as it pertains to Ukraine and Russia. Russian propagandists seem to have been given instructions to speak as negatively as possible against Kamala Harris. I've talked about how she is being called distilled evil. In this clip, Russian propagandist Markov says, quote, we're going to directly warn Americans that she's an evil puppet that's going to be imposed. You have to fight for American democracy. We've known America for 200 years. It's been a leader of democracy. It's just absolutely hilariously ironic, deeply hypocritical. Like, they're calling for democracy while they're tightening their laws anti-democratically. They live, Russia is a dictatorship, and yet they are talking about how she is a puppet. A puppet for whom? Really? Like, are you actually being serious there? Like, who do you think are we going to go down a George Soros route here? That she's been put in place by George Soros. Why aren't you talking about people like Elon Musk being a puppet master for Trump? How, before he was going to provide $45 million a month, and how he convinced Trump to have JD Vance, and it wasn't Trump's decision. Why aren't you talking about these other puppet masters? So it's only Kamala Harris who is a puppet, with her strings being pulled by, I don't know, nebulous deep state. Let's just say deep state, because that's easy. Everyone hates deep state, and all we need to do is drop these little keywords into places and everyone's brains explode. Yeah, the deep state with their trans toilets. I'm so angry about stuff I don't know that never affects me on a daily basis. I'm so angry. Vote Trump. And that's how the world works. Right, Mark Kelly and Ukraine. Let's talk Mark Kelly. Right, lots of people calling for Mark Kelly. If you're solely interested in Ukraine, Mark Kelly is the VP choice, the vice president choice for Kamala Harris for sure. But there are some caveats to apply here. Okay, he is, 60 years old? He's okay-ish in the age range. She might want to pick someone younger to really go for that young vote. He's not very good at talking in public in a way that someone like Josh Shapiro or others are. So actually, he might not be the charismatic person that you would need as a VP, maybe, you could argue. But he is a former Navy captain, a former astronaut, and is really, really strong on Ukraine. So Conor O'Brien here says, Mark Kelly, the Harris VP contender, tore into Trump and Vance over their opposition to Ukraine aid. Quote, we have a serious choice to make, and I would be really concerned about what those guys would do to abandon an ally in favour of an adversary, he told reporter Joe. So he's strong on Ukraine. Kelly's been directly involved in training Ukrainian F-16 pilots, a dream VP candidate, says John Jackson here, in response to this Politico article. Well, as a Politico piece here, Senator Mark Kelly, a Harris VP contender, rips into JD Vance on Ukraine. The two senators are on the opposite end of the spectrum on the issue of Ukraine aid. Mark Kelly, a contender to be vice president, and Harris's running mate, tore into vice president nominee Senator JD Vance on Wednesday, saying Vance would abandon Ukraine in favour of Russia. Quote, it's pretty clear to me you've got JD Vance who wants to totally abandon Ukraine, and you've got Donald Trump who has been in the past rather pro-Russia and leaned in with Vladimir Putin in ways I would never expect the president to do, Kelly said in a brief interview with Politico. So again, we have a serious choice to make, and I'd be really concerned what those guys would do to abandon an ally in favour of an adversary, and that would be a much more dangerous world. The two senators are on the opposite end of the spectrum on the issue of aiding Ukraine. As senior Senate Armed Services Committee member and former Navy pilot, Kelly has been a staunch advocate for Ukraine and has taken a hands-on role on the issue of training Ukrainian F-16 pilots at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in his home state. Vance, a Marine Corps veteran, is a vocal opponent of Ukraine aid, saying it's prolonging a bloody war Kyiv cannot win. Kelly, who this week visited the Farnborough International Air Show in England, said he used the occasion to meet with US diplomatic and military officials about how US security assistance has helped Ukraine against Russia's 2-year-old invasion. Asked if he's being vetted for the presidential ticket, Kelly declined to discuss it, saying, "I don't get into private conversations. This isn't about me. I mean, this is about Kamala Harris and making sure we win this election here in how many days? 100? Less than 100?" He said, "This is really about her and Donald Trump, a prosecutor with all this experience running against a guy who's been convicted of 34 felonies and a choice about the future, or are we going to back to the past where we were less safe?" So interesting person here, and would be a very good choice for foreign policy, I think, in terms of Ukraine, certainly. But we shall see. China supports the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and will not supply weapons to Russia, Zelensky has said. So remember, Kuleba, the foreign minister, has just visited China. Quote, "The visit of a Ukrainian official at this level is the first time in many years, and this is good. There is a clear signal that China supports Ukraine," the president said in his evening address. Some people are saying, asking whether this is a sign that Ukraine want to go to do negotiations now and that China will be heavily involved and Russia will get their own way, etc., etc. I don't think so. I think this is Zelensky doing the sensible thing, which is trying to get China on side as much as possible. There's no point just saying, "Screw you, China. You like Russia, sod you. We don't want to speak to you at all," and rejecting them, because that pushes them further towards Russia. You need to try and work with them. You might not succeed, but you've got to try, and you've got to try and put pressure on and use whatever leverage you've got. Grain and agricultural produce with a country of a billion people. What can you do to say, "Hang on, mate, you need to stop doing this and that with regard to supporting Russia." Now, talking of China and Russia, indeed, is really serious. So OSINT Defender says there was an intrusion by Chinese H-6 Badger strategic bombers near the Aleutian Islands chain off the coast of Alaska in the first incident ever when aircraft of the Chinese Air Force entered the Alaskan Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. After being detected, the bombers were intercepted by US Air Force F-16s and F-35s from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson alongside CF-18s, so those are Hornets, with the Canadian Air Force, who were stationed in Elmendorf under NORAD Air Defense Command. So there's footage of this as well. You can see cockpit footage from US-Canada intercept Chinese and Russian aircraft near Alaska in first such case. Chinese H-6 military bombers, derivatives of older Soviet aircraft have entered the Alaska ADIZ zone for the first time. So things are getting serious. Like, what's the intention? What are they trying to do there? But Russia says it scrambled fighter jets to intercept B-52 bombers previously. So someone's saying it sounds like tit for tat. Like, what are each side trying to do? What are China and Russia trying to do here? What their intentions? And it's all kind of saber rattling, isn't it? But it's dangerous. And China do seem to be, we argue so often it's a marriage of convenience with Russia, but I think there is this growing relationship between these BRICS countries and others, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, that we need to stand up and pay attention to these kind of movements. Right, I'm going to end up with a bit of talk of my favorite guys, David Sachs and Elon Musk. So there's a wild rumor going around that the leaked Twitter API listed protected accounts that allegedly won't be suspended under any circumstances. So it's a free speech advocate, free speech absolutist, Elon Musk. Well, there's been some leaked stuff that's gone out, and the account that leaked it has been suspended, right? And that's happened. And there's someone I was reading. It's like I was literally live when they suspended it. Like, this isn't like I was. These accounts include Andrew Tate, End Wokeness, who's actually run by an American right-wing political guy, I think, Libs of TikTok, and Donald Trump Jr. So these are people and accounts that are really pro-Russia, really sit on a bad end of the spectrum, and they apparently have special protections around them so they can't be suspended. So there's claims the other day that, was it Libs of TikTok or was it N Wokeness, or maybe both of them, had doxed other people. So doxing is when you out people publicly with their addresses. They've both done that, and you had Elon Musk. Previously, there was someone that didn't actually dox, but he claimed dox, and it was his son, and actually it was following the jet of Elon Musk, which is public information. And then someone came and attacked the car that Elon Musk's son was in, and he blew it up to be actually something that wasn't quite what he claimed it. And anyway, he was talking about how terrible doxing is, and yet he's got accounts that can dox, and he will not suspend them because they operate in his information ecosystem. It's really terrible. Anyway, all this stuff's coming out. The file looks a bit suspicious, says Pekka Kaluniemi. That's not how you do regex, and it doesn't really look like any programming syntax. Also, the list is surprisingly short and doesn't contain any usual suspects, and he goes into others. So grain of salt. So he's saying it might not be the case that this is definitely true, but that account has been suspended. So there are and we know that previously there's coding that is anti-pro-Ukraine Twitter handles and Twitter content. So, yeah. And then you got David Sachs, who is this guy who is, again, very anti-Ukraine, stood up at the RNC convention and splurged his nonsense and Kremlin talking points to the audience, who actually didn't receive it that well. Here's a real reason why David Sachs is pushing Russian propaganda 24/7. He's the worst investor in Silicon Valley. The European founder community has avoided him big time. VC without a deal flow equals fired by founders. I don't know quite what that means, but just interesting how David Sachs says, you were sanctioned by the SEC to Parker Conrad. Nobody else, only you. You've spent the last decade trying to shift the blame onto others for your own poor ethics. Let me tell you, coups are the man's speciality. Talking about David Sachs, who talks about a coup in the Democratic Party. Then Paul Graham, someone said, do you really want the full story of what you did to Parker to be told publicly? Because it's the worst case of an investor maltreating a founder that I've ever heard. And I've heard practically all of them. So David Sachs is having a go at this founder, Parker Conrad. And some guy saying, don't do that because we've got dirt on you, mate, that you don't want the public to hear. And Paul Graham then says, I was talking recently to another investor about whether you're the most evil person in Silicon Valley. He thought about it for a few seconds and agreed that he couldn't think of anyone else. So David Sachs is this guy who is presenting pro-Russian narrative the whole time. He's just a horrible human being that does all the stuff. He's funding. He's very pro-Trump. He seems to be funding the campaign as well. And it's just interesting when you hear these little snippets about, oh yeah, he really is an evil human being. Right, okay, that fits in with everything I understand about who he is and what he does. Anyway, that's just my little added extra snipe at David Sachs, because I think, and Elon Musk, I think those guys are a pair of prize plonkers. Take care, everybody. Speak soon. Toodle pips. Oh, and I will be doing another US election update today because there's so much news coming out consistently.